The Alpha King acts crippled to see his servants' true colors, until the new Maid. Below, the Alpha King's castle rose like a shadow against the gray sky, its tall towers sharp as the jagged rocks that surrounded it. Lightning streaked across the horizon, illuminating the tall walls and casting long, trembling shadows that danced across the narrow windows. Inside, the hallways were silent, except for the echo of hurried footsteps, the whisper of silk, and the occasional creak of the ancient stone. The Alpha King, known to his people as a ruler of iron will and unmatched strength, sat alone in his private chamber. The room smelled of old wood and burning incense, the air heavy with secrets. To the world he appeared crippled, confined to a chair, unable to walk without assistance. But those who looked closely could see the faint twitch of his fingers, the way his eyes followed every movement with sharp intelligence. His body was a mask, a carefully constructed illusion. Outside the chamber, the castle hummed with life. Servants scurried through corridors, bowing and curtsying, whispering about their king's weakness. Nobles plotted in the shadowed corners, rubbing their hands in greedy anticipation. The kingdom's people, too far from the castle to see the truth, murmured of a once great king reduced to nothing. But the Alpha King watched it all, silent, patient, and invisible behind his carefully constructed mask. It was on this stormy morning that Alara arrived. She was a new maid, sent to serve in the castle. Her eyes were bright with curiosity, but her steps were careful, cautious. Unlike the others, she did not bend too low, did not speak too quickly. She moved as if she belonged, yet carried herself with a quiet humility that made her difficult to ignore. The king observed her from the shadows. There was something in her, the way she held herself, the way her eyes lingered not on the gold and jewels, but on the people who carried them. He leaned slightly forward in his chair, listening to her greet the other servants with soft politeness, noticing the gentle firmness in her voice when she corrected a minor mistake without scolding. "Her name is Alara," whispered one maid to another, glancing toward the king's chamber. "The new one, she's different, different." That single word made the king's lips curl in the faintest smile. So many had entered his castle with ambition in their eyes, pretending loyalty while watching for opportunities to take from him. But Alara, she did not seem interested in power. That alone was dangerous in its own way, for someone who is neither naive nor greedy could see far too clearly. By midday, Alara had been given her quarters, a small room tucked away in a quiet corner of the castle. She unpacked her few belongings carefully, lining them up on the rough wooden shelf. There was a nervous excitement in her hands, but her face remained calm. She had heard stories about the Alpha King. Everyone had. Some said he had become cruel after the betrayals of his past. Others whispered that he had lost more than his legs. He had lost his heart. But she had also heard another story, one that spoke of a man of immense intelligence and justice, a king who saw through lies and deceit as easily as one breathes. Her curiosity was not born of fear or ambition. It was born of something older, a sense of destiny, of purpose she could not yet name. And so she took her first steps into the castle's heart, unaware that her presence would stir something the king had long kept buried. The Alpha King moved silently through the corridors. He had long ago trained himself to slip unnoticed among the servants and guards, listening to their conversations, reading their intentions. Today, he watched Alara quietly, fascinated by the way she observed the people around her. She noticed the fear in the young page's eyes when a noble shouted, the careful flattery of the chambermaids, the silent resentment of the cooks who felt unseen. Her attention was not malicious. It was clear, and he found it refreshing. During the afternoon, an incident occurred that would mark the beginning of their unusual connection. A young servant boy had been carrying a heavy tray of food when one of the older maids sneered at him, trying to push him into dropping it. The boy stumbled, terrified, but before the tray could crash to the floor, Alara stepped forward. "Careful," she said, placing her hands gently but firmly on his arms. "You can do it. Just breathe." The older maid scoffed. "And who are you to tell him what to do?" Alara met her gaze evenly. "Someone who doesn't want to see another person hurt for no reason." The Alpha King watched from the shadows, feeling something stir in his chest, a feeling he had not allowed himself in years. Anger, pride, and something unfamiliar all mingled at once. No one had dared stand up like that in his castle, not in front of him, not in years. Later, as the storm outside intensified, Alara found herself cleaning the king's private chamber under the guidance of an older maid. The Alpha King had been left alone, observing the flashes of lightning through his window. He did not move as she entered, but his eyes followed her carefully. "You work quietly," he said finally, his voice soft but commanding. It startled her. She had not expected him to speak. "I try," she replied, bowing slightly, careful to keep her voice steady. "You are not afraid," he said, leaning forward slightly, though still in his chair. "Most are." "I do not believe in fear without reason," she said simply. His lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "Most do not think as you do." She paused, considering her words. "Perhaps they think only what they are taught to think." The king felt a strange thrill. There was a clarity to her mind that reminded him of what he had once been, a young man who had dreamed of ruling not with fear, but with justice. Yet the weight of betrayal and ambition had hardened him into a different shape. And still, this girl, she reminded him of hope, of a world he thought he had lost forever. Days passed, and Alara continued to move through the castle with quiet diligence. The king observed her, testing her in small ways, leaving a vase precariously on a high shelf, allowing a noble to snarl at her in passing, watching her choices and responses. She never faltered. She did not seek favor, did not speak with flattery, and did not shrink before cruelty. And then, one evening, the storm brought more than rain. A messenger arrived, drenched and frantic, bearing news of a rebellion among the nobles. The king's face remained calm, but his eyes sharpened, calculating. The servants panicked, rushing through corridors with hushed whispers, wondering what would happen next. Alara, standing nearby, noticed the tension. She looked to the king, whose hands rested lightly on the arms of his chair. "Is there danger?" she asked softly, though her voice carried no fear. "There is always danger," he replied, his eyes meeting hers. "Some see weakness and try to take what is not theirs. Others test the limits of their loyalty." She nodded slowly, understanding something she could not yet name. Loyalty and truth were rare in this castle, and yet she felt a strange connection, a quiet respect for the man who had suffered and endured so much in silence. For the first time in many years, the Alpha King allowed himself to feel a spark of something he had buried: curiosity, admiration, and perhaps something more. He had entered the castle to observe his servants' true colors, to see who would betray, who would deceive, who would rise to take advantage of his supposed weakness. But in Alara he saw something unexpected, a mirror to his own resilience, a mind as sharp as his own, and a heart unafraid of truth. That night, as the wind howled and rain lashed against the castle windows, the Alpha King sat in his chamber, staring at the flickering flames. He thought of the young maid who had arrived quietly into his life, and wondered how someone so unassuming could carry such strength. And he felt for the first time in years the ache of longing, not for power or revenge or control, but for someone who could see him for who he truly was. The castle slept uneasily that night. Outside, the storm raged on, and the wind carried whispers of old secrets and new beginnings. Somewhere in the halls, a pair of eyes watched silently, calculating, waiting. The Alpha King knew the days ahead would test him, test his patience, test the fragile thread of trust he was willing to place in Alara. But he did not yet fear the outcome. Something about her made him willing to risk the unknown. And in the quiet darkness beneath the storm's roar, a single thought took root in his mind. Perhaps, For the first time in many years, he was not entirely alone. The morning sun barely pierced the thick clouds above the castle, casting long, gray shadows across the stone floors. The storm from yesterday had left the air damp and heavy, the smell of wet stone and earth lingering in every corridor. Inside, the castle seemed quieter than usual. The nobles whispered in hushed tones, servants moved faster than normal, and the Alpha King's presence was felt even when he did not appear. Elara moved quietly through the halls, carrying a tray of clean linens. Her eyes lingered on the faces of the other servants, noting the subtle shifts in their expressions. Fear, ambition, curiosity, they were all there, as if the storm had awakened hidden intentions in everyone. She did not flinch, did not falter. She had learned quickly that in this castle, strength was shown not in loud defiance, but in steady calm. The Alpha King watched her from a shadowed doorway. Even when disguised as a cripple, he could sense far more than most. He observed the way she walked, the careful grace in her movements, the attention she gave to every small detail. Her eyes did not wander to the gold or to the walls, they scanned the people. He wondered if she could see him, not the man in the chair, but the one behind the mask. Today, however, her presence would test more than her composure. A letter arrived, delivered by a trembling page. The seal was broken, the ink smeared by rain. The Alpha King's face remained calm, his fingers barely twitching as he read. The nobles had begun to act on their plans. Some sought to challenge his authority openly, while others whispered threats that only the walls could hear. Elara paused outside the chamber, unsure whether to enter. She had been given permission to clean the room in the mornings, but she had noticed other, more secretive doors and corridors. Her curiosity had grown, pulling her toward places where the ordinary maid had no reason to go. Today she found herself in front of a narrow door she had never seen open. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light spilled into the corridor. Elara's fingers itched with hesitation. She pushed it gently, stepping inside. The room was small, filled with old furniture, dust-covered tomes, and stacks of parchment. In the corner, a small chest lay closed, its edges worn with age. Her eyes fell upon a desk, cluttered with letters, maps, and sketches. Some were messages from nobles, others were personal reflections in elegant, precise handwriting. One note spoke of betrayal from a trusted servant. Another outlined strategies for observing the court. The final papers hinted at the king's secret. His strength was not gone. It was hidden, carefully concealed from those who would take advantage of it. Elara's heart raced. This was no ordinary chamber. It was a place of truth, a place where the Alpha King revealed himself only to the shadows. She did not know if she should leave or continue, but a strange compulsion urged her forward. Carefully, she ran her fingers over the letters, sensing the weight of each word. These papers were pieces of a puzzle, and she could feel the life of the man who had written them in every stroke. A sudden noise startled her, a faint shuffle of feet, careful but deliberate. Elara froze, her eyes darting toward the doorway. The Alpha King's shadow appeared, tall and commanding even in his chair. His gaze fell on her, sharp and unyielding. "You should not be here," he said, his voice quiet but carrying authority. Elara bowed slightly, her hands clasped. "Forgive me, my lord. I did not mean to intrude, I was curious." He studied her for a long moment. Most would have trembled, begged forgiveness, or tried to hide their mistake, but she did not. She met his gaze steadily, neither afraid nor arrogant. That alone was rare. "Curiosity can be dangerous," he said finally, "but it can also reveal truth." Her eyes widened slightly. "Truth?" she asked. "Yes," he replied. "Most people here lie to survive, some lie to gain. Few speak honestly. You are different." Elara felt warmth rise in her chest. For the first time, the king acknowledged her presence not as a servant, but as someone capable of understanding. She had seen him as a figure of mystery and fear. Now, she saw a man burdened with pain, weighed down by secrets he did not trust anyone to witness. The Alpha King leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing in thought. "Tell me, Maid, do you believe that a person's heart can remain true even when surrounded by lies?" Alara hesitated. She had learned the value of careful words in the castle, yet something in the king's gaze made her speak honestly. "I believe it can," she said softly, "if they have courage enough to choose it, even when it is dangerous." He regarded her silently for a long time, the flickering light of the candles reflecting in his sharp eyes. Then, unexpectedly, he allowed himself a small nod. It was the first acknowledgement of trust he had given to anyone in years. Later that day, the Alpha King began to test her further. He allowed small challenges, a heavy vase placed on a high shelf, a noble attempting to provoke her with harsh words, and a delicate arrangement of letters that required her to observe carefully and act wisely. Each time she handled the situations with intelligence, caution, and subtle courage. It was during one such challenge that the tension of the castle reached a peak. A noble, greedy and cunning, tried to trick Alara into revealing a secret he believed only the servants knew. He cornered her in a narrow hallway, smiling with cruel satisfaction. "You are new here," he said, his voice low. "Do you think you can survive if you betray the king's trust?" Alara's heart beat steadily. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she observed him, noting the tension in his hands, the way his eyes darted to the shadows, and the subtle tremor in his voice. Then she spoke calmly, "I serve, but not blindly. I follow only what is right." The noble's expression faltered. Few dared speak to him with such steadiness, and none with clarity of thought. He backed away, muttering excuses, leaving Alara standing alone in the corridor, her chest rising and falling steadily despite the fear she had felt moments before. The Alpha King had watched from above unseen. He felt an unusual warmth, a quiet pride, and a pang of longing he could not name. Most would have faltered, would have crumbled under the pressure of nobles and intrigue. Yet she had remained steady. Not naive, not weak, strong, thoughtful, and unafraid. As the evening descended, the castle grew quieter. The storm outside had passed, leaving the world outside dripping and cold, but inside, a different storm brewed. The nobles whispered more urgently about rebellion and schemes, servants feared the coming nights, and the Alpha King sat alone in his chamber, thinking. Alara returned to her quarters, her mind alive with the day's events. She had glimpsed the truth of the castle, seen the subtle currents of power and fear that ran through every corridor. But more importantly, she had seen the Alpha King, not the figure everyone feared, but the man beneath the mask. A man who carried the weight of betrayal and the burden of power, yet had a spark of something unexpected: hope. The night grew deeper, and the moon cast its pale light through the tall windows of the castle. In his chamber, the Alpha King remained seated, his hands resting lightly on the arms of his chair. He thought of the young maid who had entered his life quietly, carefully, and yet had already begun to change it. For years he had watched the castle, observing every betrayal, every ambition, every false smile. But now, for the first time, he was not merely observing. He was feeling. Something long buried, almost forgotten, stirred within him. And it was connected to her, the quiet maid who did not flinch, who did not bow too low, who did not speak with false words. In the stillness of the night, he allowed himself a thought he had not dared for many years. Perhaps there was more to life than strategy, than power, than survival. Perhaps there was someone worth trusting. But even as he allowed this thought, he felt the shadow of the world around him pressing close. Nobles would not wait. Enemies would not pause. And even in the quiet trust he had begun to feel, he could not forget the lessons of his past. Alara in her small quarters lay awake as well. Her thoughts were tangled with curiosity, with wonder, with the strange pull she felt toward the man in the chair. Something about him called to her, even as a part of her wondered if she should turn away. But she could not. She had glimpsed a truth few others saw, and that truth demanded attention, demanded action. The castle slept uneasily that night, caught between the calm after the storm and the rising tensions within. Outside, the wind whispered through the towers, carrying echoes of betrayal and loyalty, danger and courage. And inside, two souls, so different yet drawn together, sensed the stirrings of a connection that could change them both. The Alpha King thought of her again as the first light of dawn began to touch the windows. He knew the days ahead would be dangerous. He knew that secrets would be revealed, that loyalties would be tested. But for the first time in many years, he did not feel entirely alone. Elara would soon learn the full weight of the castle's shadowed halls, the dangers that lurked behind polite smiles and whispered words. And the Alpha King would discover whether trust could survive in a place built on fear. For now, though, they rested, aware, cautious, and drawn together by a silent, unspoken thread that promised both challenge and awakening. The castle awoke under a pale, gray sky. The storm had passed, but the air remained thick with tension. Rumors of rebellion and betrayal had spread like wildfire among the nobles, and the servants whispered in corners, glancing at each other with wide eyes. No one dared to speak too loudly. No one dared to make a mistake. Elara moved through the corridors with a quiet purpose. The events of the past days had left her mind alive with questions. She could see the subtle ways the nobles tested the servants, the quiet schemes that lingered in their smiles, and the fear that twisted even the strongest among the castle's staff. But through it all, she noticed the Alpha King, his presence like a shadow that followed her, unseen but felt. The king had begun to trust her in ways he had not with anyone in years. He allowed her small privileges, letting her carry messages through secret corridors, asking her opinion on matters of loyalty and duty, and even sharing bits of the kingdom's history he had never spoken aloud. Each day he watched her closely, fascinated by her mind, her courage, and the quiet strength in her heart. But today, the castle felt different. The whispers of rebellion were no longer faint. A group of nobles had begun plotting more openly, taking advantage of the rumors of the king's feigned weakness. They believed the Alpha King was vulnerable, that he could be overthrown. And yet, no one had dared to test him directly. Elara, unaware of the full danger, moved toward the kitchens to fetch supplies. The hallways seemed longer than usual, shadowed and silent. She sensed eyes on her, but when she turned, she saw only servants scurrying past, heads bowed. Something in the atmosphere told her that the castle itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. In the king's chamber, he sat quietly, listening. Every footstep, every whispered word in the hall was a note in the symphony of the court. He had long ago mastered the art of patience, and now he allowed the rebellion to take shape, knowing he needed to see the truth of those around him. But he also knew that the storm would reach its peak soon. The first act of betrayal came in the afternoon. A trusted advisor who had always appeared loyal slipped a poisoned cup meant for the king's personal use. The Alpha King noticed the subtle tremble in the hand of the servant carrying it. He did not flinch. With a quiet motion, he intercepted the cup, allowing the servant to pass it along before revealing the truth of the plot. Elara nearby had seen a shadow move strangely, a hesitation that did not belong. She watched as the king's eyes narrowed, a cold fire sparking within. Something about the scene made her pulse quicken. She had never seen anger like that before, controlled, yet overwhelming. "You must be careful whom you trust," the king said quietly, though the shadow of danger lingered in his gaze. "Even those who smile can carry betrayal in their hearts." Elara nodded, sensing the weight of his words. "I understand, my lord," she said softly, "but not everyone is false. Some still choose truth, even when it is hard." The king's eyes softened for a brief moment. Few had ever spoken such words with conviction in this castle, and even fewer had meant them. He leaned back, his mind turning over strategies, both for protecting the kingdom and for testing the hearts of those within. Later that evening, the king asked Alara to assist him in preparing for a council meeting with the nobles. The room was darkened by thick velvet curtains, and the faint light of candles cast flickering shadows across the walls. The nobles entered one by one, their expressions polite but cold, eyes sharp with ambition. The king remained seated, motionless in his chair, watching. Alara noticed the subtle tension in the room. Every smile, every nod, every carefully chosen word was a test. She moved quietly, carrying papers, placing messages, observing without being observed. The nobles spoke of loyalty, of service, and of rumors that challenged the king's strength. They believed him weak. They did not know that he had seen everything, that he had anticipated every move. As the council progressed, one noble became bold, stepping forward with a challenge, questioning the king's decisions, hinting at rebellion. The room fell silent, every pair of eyes on the Alpha King. For a moment it seemed as if the king would remain still, unresponsive. But then, with a subtle motion, he revealed his strength, not in words but in presence. He rose from his chair, moving swiftly despite the supposed injury. The nobles gasped. The illusion had fallen away. The Alpha King was not weak. He was stronger than any of them had imagined. His eyes glinted with authority, and his voice, calm yet firm, silenced the room. "You mistake patience for weakness," he said. "You believe I am broken, that I cannot act, but I have watched and waited, and now the truth is clear. You are revealed." Some nobles stepped back, fear flickering in their eyes. Others, bold and foolish, tried to hide their panic. The room was thick with tension, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Alara, standing nearby, felt a thrill of fear and admiration. She had never seen courage like this, a presence so commanding and yet controlled. The king's gaze found hers for a brief moment. In it there was recognition, not of her rank or her role, but of her mind and heart. She had seen him, truly seen him, even in the mask he had worn for so long. And he had seen her, the courage and honesty that set her apart from the rest. That night the castle was restless. The nobles retreated to their chambers, plotting in secret. The servants whispered of the king's display, some in awe, some in fear. And the Alpha King returned to his private chamber, his mind turning over the events of the day. Alara followed, quietly, unsure whether she should enter. She paused at the doorway, watching him. There was a sadness in his eyes now, a reflection of the burdens he carried alone. She felt a pull in her chest, a desire to offer comfort, yet she remained silent, respecting the distance that had always existed between them. The king spoke without turning. "You did well today," he said softly. "You saw what many would have missed. You understand more than you realize." Alara stepped forward cautiously. "I only observe what is in front of me, my lord," she said. "I have much to learn." He allowed himself a faint smile, one that did not touch his eyes but softened the corners of his lips. "And yet you see more than most. That is rare and valuable." The night stretched on, quiet except for the distant wind and the soft crackle of the fireplace. The king's thoughts were heavy with the knowledge of betrayal and the tension that now filled the castle. But there was also a new feeling, one he had not dared to name in years. He felt a connection to the young maid who had entered his life quietly, carefully, and yet had begun to stir something in him long buried. Alara, lying awake in her small room, thought of the day's events. She had witnessed the king's strength, his wisdom, and his unyielding patience. She had seen the weight of responsibility he carried, and she had begun to understand the complexity of his world. Her heart was stirred by admiration, by respect, and by something deeper she could not yet define. The next morning brought more challenges. The nobles, though shaken, had begun to regroup, testing the loyalty of the servants and seeking weaknesses in the king's rule. The Alpha King, however, anticipated each move. He had begun to use Alara in subtle ways, allowing her to observe, to act, to participate in the castle's intricate dance of power. Each day she learned more, and each day he saw more of her potential, her courage, and her strength. Then a new threat emerged, one that neither of them had anticipated. A messenger arrived with news of a neighboring kingdom, ready to exploit the unrest within the Alpha King's walls. The nobles whispered of alliances and plots, the servants feared the unknown, and the castle seemed to hum with a tension that was almost tangible. The king called a council in secret, and Alara was allowed to attend, not as a maid but as an observer of strategy. She saw the nobles' fear, their calculations, and their whispered schemes. She saw the king's mind at work, calm, calculating, and always one step ahead. And she felt a thrill of awe mixed with worry. The dangers were growing and the castle's shadows were deepening. As the council concluded, the king remained in the chamber, alone with Alara. "The world is changing," he said softly, "and we must change with it or fall." Alara nodded, understanding more than words could express. "I will do what I can to help," she said. He studied her for a long moment as if weighing the truth of her words. "You are brave," he said finally, "and brave hearts are rare, but courage alone is not enough. Wisdom and patience are just as important, remember that." The night fell again, quiet and heavy. The castle, though outwardly calm, thrummed with secrets, schemes, and unseen dangers. And within it, two souls, one burdened by power and betrayal, the other guided by courage and insight, began to understand the fragile bond forming between them. But the shadows were not yet done. Outside, unseen eyes watched the castle, waiting for a moment of weakness, waiting for a chance to strike. The Alpha King and Alara were on the edge of awakening, both to their own strengths and to the dangers that threatened everything they had come to value. In the quiet of the night, the king allowed himself a thought he had not dared to hold in many years. Perhaps there was someone who could stand beside him, not as a servant, not as a subject, but as a true companion. And perhaps, just perhaps, she was that person. The castle slept uneasily, and the storm of betrayal and awakening continued to build. Outside, the wind whispered of dangers and loyalty, of choices and consequences. And inside, two hearts, so different yet drawn together, sensed the stirrings of a connection that would be tested in ways neither could yet imagine. The sun rose pale and cold over the castle, casting long shadows across the wet stone. The storm had passed fully now, leaving the cliffs glistening with rain, the wind whispering through the towers like a quiet warning. Inside, the castle felt alive with tension. Whispers of rebellion and treachery had grown louder, but for the first time in weeks, the Alpha King's presence filled the halls like a living shadow. Alara moved through the corridors, carrying messages and observing carefully. Today was different. There was a sharpness in the air, a feeling that everything might change before the night ended. She had grown accustomed to the castle's rhythms, but even she could not ignore the unease that rippled through every stone and shadow. The Alpha King sat in his chamber, calm as ever, though his eyes betrayed the storm within. Reports had come in, nobles plotting in secret, foreign forces gathering at the borders, and whispers of magic stirring in places long thought dormant. He had prepared for these challenges, yet even he knew that strategy alone would not secure the castle or the kingdom. Courage, loyalty, and trust would be tested in ways that could not be measured on a map or in reports. Alara approached the chamber cautiously, holding a stack of letters and notices from the servants. Her hands were steady, but her heart beat faster than usual. She had learned much since arriving in the castle, how to read intentions, how to act quietly, and how to see the hidden currents of power. But the dangers ahead felt larger than anything she had imagined. "My lord," she said softly, bowing slightly, "the messages you requested. And there is news of movement outside the walls. Scouts report unusual activity near the northern border." The Alpha King took the papers, his gaze sharp as he scanned each message. "I expected as much," he said quietly. "The world outside grows restless. It tests us as it always does. Alara glanced at him, sensing the weight in his voice. "And what will we do?" she asked, though she already had an inkling. He leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "We act carefully, but we also wait, observe, and choose the right moment. Power without patience is lost. Strength without wisdom is wasted." Hours passed, and the castle prepared for what was coming. Servants moved with quiet efficiency, nobles whispered in secret chambers, and the Alpha King's presence was felt everywhere without him needing to speak. Alara, though still young and new to the ways of power, felt the surge of responsibility in her chest. She had grown in these halls, not in rank or title, but in understanding, courage, and insight. The first test came that evening. A group of nobles, emboldened by their belief that the Alpha King was weakened, attempted to seize control of the main gate, planning to rally soldiers from within the walls. The Alpha King had anticipated their move, having prepared a trap that required not only strategy but perfect timing and calm under pressure. Alara followed him quietly as he moved to intercept the nobles. She had never seen him move with such speed and grace. The chair, once thought to symbolize weakness, was nothing but a mask for patience and cunning. He commanded the room not with anger but with presence, speaking words that carried authority and truth. "You are fools," he said to the group, his voice cold and steady. "You believe I am weak. You believe the kingdom is yours to claim, but you are wrong. You have shown your colors, and now you will face the consequences." The nobles faltered, some trying to hide their panic, others attempting defiance. But the Alpha King's eyes were like steel. He did not need to raise a hand. His calm control and command of the situation was enough to show them that their plans had failed before they began. Alara watched, breathless. The courage she had admired in him, the patience and intelligence, all came together in this moment. He was not merely a king. He was the master of his world, a force that no ambition could sway. Yet, even in this display of power, she sensed something else: care, protection, and perhaps even a faint trust placed in her presence. When the nobles were removed from the main gate and secured in the castle, the Alpha King turned to Alara. "You handled yourself well," he said quietly. "You observed, you understood, and you did not falter. That is rare." Alara bowed, a blush rising to her cheeks. "I only did what I could," she said softly. I learned from you, my lord." He allowed himself a small, rare smile. "And yet, you teach me as well. You remind me that even in darkness one can find clarity. Courage can be quiet and wisdom can be gentle. That is something many here have forgotten." The night deepened, and the storm of political and foreign danger continued to grow. But within the castle, a quiet bond began to form between the king and the young maid. It was not yet spoken, not yet defined, but both sensed the connection, a shared understanding, a trust that had begun to grow despite the dangers around them. The next day brought a new challenge. Scouts reported that a small contingent of foreign forces had crossed the northern border and were approaching the castle. The Alpha King called a council, but only a few trusted advisors were allowed to attend. Alara, once a mere observer, was now invited to witness the strategy session. The room was tense. Maps were spread across the table, and every word was measured, every gesture calculated. The Alpha King outlined a plan that relied not on brute force, but on clever strategy, patience, and the cooperation of those who could be trusted. He spoke quietly, each sentence deliberate, and the room hung on his every word. Alara watched, absorbing every detail. She understood the risks, the stakes, and the responsibility that rested on his shoulders. And yet, she also understood something deeper. The Alpha King had allowed her into this circle not merely to observe, but because he trusted her judgment. As the plan was set into motion, the castle prepared for battle. Soldiers took positions, gates were reinforced, and messages were sent to allies. The nobles who had attempted rebellion were watched closely, their movements anticipated at every turn. And the Alpha King, though calm on the surface, carried the weight of the entire kingdom in his heart. When the foreign forces reached the castle walls, they found not weakness, but a fortress alive with strategy, patience, and quiet strength. The Alpha King led from the shadows, observing every move, guiding his soldiers with subtle commands, and ensuring that no unnecessary harm came to those loyal to him. Alara remained close, assisting where she could, observing where she could not. Her courage, her insight, and her understanding proved invaluable. Together, they navigated the storm of danger, each step a test of trust, patience, and strength. By nightfall, the castle had repelled the attack. The foreign forces withdrew, their plans foiled, their confidence shaken. Inside the walls, the nobles who had plotted rebellion were humbled, their ambitions exposed and contained. And the Alpha King, though weary, had emerged not only victorious, but stronger in ways he had not anticipated. As the castle settled into a quiet evening, the king and Alara found themselves alone in his chamber. The fire flickered, casting shadows across the walls, and the weight of the past days hung between them. "You have done well," the king said quietly, his voice softer than it had been in weeks. "More than I could have asked. You have seen truth, acted wisely, and stood firm when others faltered." Alara looked at him, her heart full of admiration and something deeper she had not yet named. I could not have done it alone," she said softly. "You guided me, even when I did not understand the full weight of your trust." The king studied her, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel fully without the mask, without the illusion of weakness. "Perhaps," he said, "there is more than strategy, more than patience and power. Perhaps there is trust, and perhaps there is something more. I have lived long enough to fear attachment, but now," he paused, letting the words hang between them, unspoken but understood. Alara felt a warmth in her chest, a quiet hope. "Perhaps," she said softly, echoing his thought. The castle, once a place of shadows, deceit, and fear, now felt different. Within its walls, trust and understanding had begun to take root. The Alpha King, who had long guarded his heart behind the mask of weakness, now saw the possibility of companionship, courage, and even love. And Alara, who had entered the castle as a simple maid, had proven herself brave, wise, and indispensable. As they stood together, looking toward the window and the distant cliffs, both sensed the future stretching ahead, uncertain, full of challenge, but also full of possibility. The castle's walls had held secrets for centuries, but now, within those walls, something new was born. Hope, trust, and a bond that neither time nor danger could easily break. Outside, the wind whispered through the towers, carrying echoes of the storm, of battle, and of triumph. Inside, two hearts, once separated by fear, pride, and duty, now understood one another. Their connection was fragile yet strong, quiet yet undeniable. And though the world beyond the castle remained uncertain, they faced it together, united, vigilant, and ready for whatever came next. The Alpha King removed the mask of weakness entirely for the first time, allowing himself to be seen. Alara stepped closer, her presence a steady reassurance. In that quiet, fleeting moment, both understood. The past could not harm them if they faced the future together. And in the heart of a castle built on power and fear, something rare and beautiful had begun. A bond that would endure beyond storms, beyond treachery, beyond the shadows.